Hi everyone, so it's that time of the month again. It is the beginning of a new month, which means it's time to wrap up the old month and talk about all the books that I read. In this instance, I always struggle with this, August. We're in September now, I'm wrapping up August and review them for you and let you know what my thoughts were. Before we do get into the reviews, however, I would like to say a massive thank you to today's sponsor, who is Skillshare. Now, if you've watched every single video ever on my channel, then you may have seen that I've talked about Skillshare in the past. They are an absolutely incredible learning resource online. Their website offers thousands of courses and classes on like every subject under the sun that you might want to learn about. It's so much fun. I've spent time on there learning to knit, learning to world build in novel writing, as well as learning to use my Adobe Creator Suite better, and it's so wonderful how much selection there is, particularly recently as I have been developing my sewing skills. I tried to learn how to use my mum's sewing machine a little while ago, but I wasn't living in Edinburgh, so I didn't really have the time to sit with it and sort of really like grow with it as a sewer. And now that I'm back in Edinburgh and living with my mum at the moment, I'm really taking advantage of that. In particular, I found Jane Hassler's How to Sew course a great place to start, and at the moment I've been actually using it to do a lot of like little alterations and repairs to my clothing, which has been fantastic, just like taking things in, taking things up, and it makes such a difference, especially if like me, you do a lot of your clothing shopping second hand and maybe things just aren't quite perfect, or you've had something for a while and you don't want to waste it, you want to keep wearing it, because it's so important in terms of sustainability to sort of make use of what you do have. However, thanks to all of the incredible resources on Skillshare, I actually feel ready to start on my first patterns, and I bought these vintage patterns on Depop. In particular, I'm hoping that this little skirt is going to be quite like a nice easy starter piece of clothing. And I know some friends who, when learning to sew and use their sewing machines, have like ventured off out into the world and have attended classes with a teacher to learn how to use it, but obviously that's not something that is as easy to do right now, or that a lot of us are comfortable doing right now, and I really appreciate being able to learn to use my machine here at home with the courses available on Skillshare. If you would like to give the massive selection of courses on Skillshare a try, then there will be a link in the description box down below that will offer the first 1,000 of you a 2-month free trial of Skillshare Premium. So make sure to take full advantage of that while you're here, and once again, thank you so much to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. First up is actually a comic book volume, and it's Ghosted in LA Volume 1 by Sina Grace, Siobhan Keenan and Kathy Lee. This is a comic book that I read over on Scribd. It was actually uploaded in individual issues, so I read the first 4 issues, which makes up the first trade paperback bind up, and then rated that as a whole on Goodreads, which I gave 4 stars. And I obviously really enjoyed this one from my rating. It was a lot of fun, particularly because it really felt like a lot happened. Sometimes I find in the first volumes of comic book series, in those bind ups of 4 or 5 issues, it feels very introductory, and yes, a lot of establishing groundwork is set in this first volume, but it also felt like there was meat and there was plot and there was stuff to get your teeth into, and there was surprises and plot twists, and that was fantastic. So I was really impressed it managed to do all that in a first 4 issues. It's about this young woman who's just graduated high school, and she's off to college for the first time, and she ends up going away for school to the same college as her boyfriend, but as soon as she gets there, she is dumped. She's unceremoniously broken up with and finds herself in LA, not the place she originally intended to go to college, by herself with no friends and no boyfriend, and staying in a dorm with someone that she doesn't get on with. So it's all pretty much off to a bad start, until she's wandering around one evening and stumbles across a haunted LA mansion full of a group of ghosts, and in return for helping them with like tasks they can't do as ghosts, so like picking things up, fetching them, doing errands, bringing people to them, they are going to let her stay in this mansion, and she figures, why not? It's obviously a little bit of a mad premise, but it really works, and it was a really fun concept. I've not read anything quite like that, and it's like a blend of obviously contemporary with that college setting, the ups and downs of young romance, as well as paranormal with the ghost side of things. And I just overall really thought it worked well. Like I said, it managed to do a lot in this first 4 volumes. Like, there was plot twists in every issue really, I felt like every issue introduced something that was maybe a surprise, so it never got boring, it never felt like preamble before the real storyline, but I also got to know the characters, and that's also really, really important, and it left me intrigued for the next volume. I'm certainly going to be reading on with this one, and I like that blend because I've been enjoying more contemporary comic books recently, to my surprise actually. But I've always enjoyed a paranormal comic book, so it was nice to kind of have both those things in one place. The art is also beautiful, which is important when it comes to a comic book. Really detailed and imaginative and suits the storyline really well. And all in all, if you're a comic book reader, I would certainly recommend checking this one out. I actually finished that comic book at the end of the Finish-On readathon, which was a readathon that ran from July to August, so I wrapped up some of those books in my July wrap up, and now obviously I'm wrapping up some of them in my August wrap up. And the other one that I finished for the Finish-A-thon was Girls of Storm and Shadow, which is the sequel to Girls of Paper and Fire by Natasha Nangan. And the reason I had put this one down and left a few months between picking it back up was because I'd left it in London when I moved up to Edinburgh and didn't have it for a few months, which is unfortunate because it had been the book I was sort of actively reading before I headed up here, and this gave me the perfect opportunity to wrap it up. So Girls of Paper and Fire is one of my all-time favourite YA fantasy and like queer lit books. I love it. And I love it particularly for that element of the relationship between the two central female characters. Our main character is a teenage girl named Lei, who is taken from her home to be one of that year's concubines to the king. Every year the king has a group of concubines from the lowest class of their society, which is the paper caste, and he basically forces them into sexual slavery. They have no choice in the matter, and she is forced into this position at court and is navigating the sort of sexual violence, the trauma, the court life, and the relationships with all the other girls who have been taken as well, and in between all of that falls in love with another of the concubines. And book 2 is quite different because book 1 is quite like an insular novel. It's set in the court and we're following everyday court events and what's happening, whereas book 2 is more of like an adventure journey storyline, which is quite typical of fantasy, and like adventure story journey story arcs are like sort of fantasy's bread and butter. So it fell more into this side of things. We got more about the political background to the society, the different factions, and learn more of that side of things, and I really enjoyed that. I really enjoyed like the world building, but I kind of also missed some of what book 1 had offered, which was that kind of like insular setting with Lei and the other young women that she falls in love with, and just seeing them sort of like together, more cut off and just building their relationship, which I didn't feel like was as much a part of book 2, but at the same time I also thought there was some incredible aspects to book 2 because it very much explored the after trauma of sexual violence. This is not a series that uses sexual violence against women as like a casual plot device. It's exploring the trauma, the mental and physical trauma it leaves behind, and I think that is so impressively done throughout this series, and I have so much respect for Natasha Nangan. I think she's doing something so important in the fantasy genre, and I still love Lei, and I still love her character and her journey, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what is in store in book 3, which I believe is the final book in the series. Next we have The Lady's Deception by Susanna Craig. Now this is technically the third book in a historical romance trilogy where each different book follows a different protagonist. So I did read this one not having read books 1 and 2, but because they follow independent protagonists or just set in the same sort of family grouping, that was completely fine. Like that worked completely fine, and I think you could really start anywhere with this trilogy, and if you're into historical romance, it's one I would really recommend. This was such a sort of like pleasant surprise. I didn't really know what to expect. I'd requested it for review on NetGalley because I thought the plot sounded interesting, and it's turned out to introduce me to like a real new favourite historical romance writer. Like I feel there's a similarity in tone between Susanna Craig and Tessa Dare, who's my favourite historical romance writer. It had like a little bit of humour to it, and I really enjoy that in my historical romance. So that was what kind of reminded me of Tessa Dare. That's not to say it's not unique and individual in its own way, but if you're a fan of Tessa Dare, then I think you'll like Susanna Craig. And this one was about a young English woman who has been taken over to Ireland to follow one of her older brother's friends, or staying with one of his friends, and it turns out that he's going to marry her off to this man, and this man tries it on with her, like he makes unwanted advances towards her, and she feels like she needs to escape and flee because her brother is basically using her as like a bargaining tool. So she decides, because she's not quite 21, which is when she would no longer be under her brother's guardianship, to seek out a lawyer a few months before she turns 21, so she doesn't have to marry this man. I'm actually blanking right now, but I think it's in Belfast, but she basically treks to the actual city and finds a lawyer, but when she comes across this Irish lawyer, he is a little bit drunk, and he mistakes her for the nanny that he has sent away for to take care of his 2 younger sisters. So she sees this as an opportunity to actually just hide from her brother for a couple of months until she's old enough, and then maybe get this lawyer's help and just sort of like find like protection because she has nowhere else to go. So she decides to play along with that and say that she is the nanny that he sent for, and ends up taking care of his 2 younger sisters. But of course they fall in love because it's a historical romance genre. Like, if that didn't happen, it wouldn't be a historical romance book. And it's so cute. I feel like the 2 younger siblings really bring that comical sort of relief to the storyline. They like add a little bit of like fun and levity, and I enjoyed their interactions as a family. They are such a fun family, and actually books 1 and 2 in this series are about the male love interest's older sisters. So they're his younger sisters, he also has 2 older sisters, and I believe book 1 is about one of them and book 2 is about the other one, and I have since got both of them. I got one on Kindle and one physically because I'm so keen to keep reading this author and also just like follow this family, because they just seem so lovely and endearing, and I'm looking forward to learning more of the backstory of his 2 older sisters who you do meet in book 3. And it was just such good fun. Like, one of the things I really appreciated about this book is that it is not the kind of romance story where there's constant irritating misunderstandings between the love interests that cause them to fall out with one another and hate each other for the span of like 24 hours before they make up again. I kind of hate that. I hate when there's like moments in romance novels where they're like, oh, well, you know, I don't think she actually loves me, so I'm just going to like avoid her. And I don't know, like, it's not that they always know what's going on, or obviously they're keeping secrets from one another and maybe not being forthright with their feelings, but it never feels like pointless misunderstandings. It always feels like, when able, they communicate, and I really appreciated that. That was like one of my favourite things about this book, and I wish more romance novels were like that. At no point did I feel like either the female or male protagonists were particularly dislikable, because I hate when there's like real moments particularly can often happen with the male love interest where they get like all machismo and ornery over the women, and that just like wasn't a part of this, and I really loved it. I really liked both male and female protagonists, loved their relationship, loved the tone of the novel, and I'm looking forward to reading more by this author. We then have another sequel, in fact another second book in a trilogy, and that is Ravenflight by Juliet Marillier, which is book 2 in the Shadowfell series. Now, Juliet Marillier, as you know, is one of my favourite authors of all time. She writes beautiful historical fantasy novels, and this series is her most like traditional YA. She mainly writes adult, has a couple of YA books, and this one in particular very much falls into what you expect from YA. It's like an overarching plot that covers the entire trilogy, whereas a lot of her other books have sort of independent storylines following different protagonists in each book. And I like the Shadowfell books, but when I compare them to her other books, they are not my favourite. I still love them, because I love Juliet Marillier, and I think she still does really clever, beautiful historical settings in a way that I don't read in a lot of other fantasy. But knowing what she can achieve with not only her adult work, but some of her other YA, like Wildwood Dancing, I know that this isn't, for me, what I want from her, if that makes sense. Basically, it's by an author I love, and I still like the books, but I love her other books so much more that like I have such high expectations of them that these just feel like a little bit more generic. However, there are some things I really appreciate about this series. First of all, it's set in what appears to be like an ancient medieval-ish fantasy version of Scotland called Alba, which is the Gaelic name for Scotland, and there's lots of references to Celtic and Scottish folklore. So we have a lot of like fairy type creatures who are like straight off the pages of like the Scottish folktales I used to read as a child, and that I love. And actually, I think Juliet Marillier, for not being a Scot, does Scottish dialect quite well. So when she writes from the perspective of certain characters and writes their dialogue, the Scots that she uses and just like the dialect way of speaking doesn't feel forced, and is a lot better than a lot of the kind of Scottish dialect I've seen written by other authors. So I feel like she's done her research and she puts a lot into her books. However, I would say the audiobook, which is what I listened to for part of book 2, isn't as fantastic in terms of like the Scottish accents. Most people have an English accent, I guess just because the narrator is English, but the fairies have Scottish accents and they're not fantastic. They're not the worst ones, but as a Scot, I'm obviously hypercritical, and when I listen to non-Scottish people attempting Scottish accents, I can tell and it makes me cringe a little bit. So I personally would recommend reading the physical book, but at the same time I think it's hard because I feel like the narrator actually does a really good job overall. She's a great narrator, she sort of brings the story to life. I just cringe when I hear the Scottish accent. So if you're not Scottish, that probably wouldn't bother you. But if I didn't mention already, and I don't think I did, this is set in a world where magic is essentially banned. Like the fair folk have been driven out of the land, the country, by an evil king. We have an evil king who basically only lets people have magic if they're like entirely loyal to him, and everybody else either gets killed or their magic destroyed or their minds destroyed. And it's really dark, and there's some like really dark moments in book 2. Like I feel like the darkness factor crept up because we had more interactions with the king and his system of ruling. So that was quite like jarring, and it's definitely not a book where the stakes are low. The stakes are high, but I enjoyed reading more about the development of our main character, who has a special affinity with the Fae and can communicate with them in a way that not a lot of other people can do, and that's sort of her blessing. And she really grows as a character in book 2. She's a really endearing character. I really like her actually, and like I said, it's an overarching plot line which carries on throughout 3 books, so it will be fun to read the conclusion in book 3, but it's not necessarily the Juliet Marillier book series I would say start with. We then have Girls Against God by Jenny Hval, which is a translated book originally written in Norwegian. It was translated by Marjam Idris, and it's my first Jenny Hval book. Jenny Hval is a musician, and she has another book called Paradise Rot, which I meant to read, never got around to, and then was approved to review Girls Against God on NetGalley. So decided to read it for my reading the lowest rated books on my TBR video, and I will link that video down below because I had a lot to say in that video about this book. I had a lot of thoughts as I read along with it, and really like sort of went in depth, I think, to my immediate reactions in a way that I'm not sure I can entirely summarize here. I enjoyed this book, I didn't love this book, but it's the kind of book that some people are going to adore and others are going to hate. It is not a story per se, like there's no real plot, it's more the musings and internal monologue and hypothetical film script writing of a young female script writer in Norway. So we do hear about her in school, and then we also hear about film school, and she's sort of writing these scripts and they sort of get muddled in with her own daily life, and she's a very angry young woman, but it's this sort of like righteous female anger against the patriarchy and a traditional conservative society in which she's grown up in, the way in which she as a young woman feels ostracized by her society, but then equally how the alternative scene that she is trying to get involved in, like the metal scene, are very male dominated, so even there as a woman she feels ostracized, and trying to find an outlet for that anger, particularly through her writing and her conversations with her 2 friends. And that's kind of what this book is all about, but it's not like a story, it's not a book with a real plot, and for that reason, like I said, it's going to be for some people, it's not going to be for other people. Some people I think are going to so gel with this book. It could be a book that they completely see themselves in and it's like 5 out of 5 stars. Otherwise, where some people are just going to absolutely hate it, and I can completely see why. I feel like I kind of fall in the middle because I think it was really well written and I could appreciate some of the themes in the book, but at the same time I found my mind wandering and not always connecting with it because of the lack of storyline. So it depends on what kind of reader you are. We then have We Are All the Same in the Dark by Julia Heberlin, which is a thriller novel set in Texas. And it's actually my fourth thriller, or fourth book in general, by Jenny Hval. Jenny Hval's Black Eyed Susans is one of my favourite thrillers of all time. I think everything about that book is just perfect in terms of what I want from a thriller. Then the other two books I enjoyed by her but didn't love as much as Black Eyed Susans. However, We Are All the Same in the Dark brought me back to those heights. Like, this was a sort of, it's different from Black Eyed Susans. If you've read Black Eyed Susans, these are not the same books. They're actually quite different in lots of respects, but it was like the same feeling for me as a reader and impressed me as much as Black Eyed Susans, if that makes sense. I almost feel if anything in this book, there was like a slightly more literary edge to the storyline. Like, the writing in this one is really gorgeous. Like, I feel like it's really elevated. Not that the writing's not excellent in her other books, but it's a different kind of writing style. I felt like it was more about atmosphere and imagery, and it really like got inside my head, and I thought it was really beautiful. In fact, atmosphere is something that is very prevalent throughout this book. It creates a very like, in fact, in all of Julia Heberlin's books, she really brings to life like the sort of hot Texas setting, and I always feel like I'm there. I've not read a lot of books set in Texas, so I always really quite enjoy that about her books, but this one just in particular really just helped me like feel like I was there and I was witnessing what was going on. But at the same time, there are twists and turns in this book in the way it's told that I don't think you will expect going into it, and obviously I don't want to spoil those, but like, it's slightly unusual in its narrative. However, the plot itself is accurate. It is about three main characters really. We have Wyatt, whose sister went missing about 10 years ago, his ex-girlfriend Ophelia, who is now a cop and is 10 years later and she's moved back to town with her new husband, and also Angel, who is a like 13-year-old girl that Wyatt finds on the side of the road, and it reminds him of his sister. I think just the concept of like a lost girl. But everybody has always assumed that Wyatt killed his sister, and that's what the sort of town thinks of him, which has led him to be kind of ostracised. Ophelia, meanwhile, has always sort of held a torch for Wyatt, even though their relationship fell apart after his sister went missing and she was in a car crash and lost one of her legs. So it's about the mystery of 10 years ago when Wyatt's sister went missing and what happened there, and Ophelia trying to understand who's hiding secrets from her, whether she can solve it, whether her trust in Wyatt is founded, as well as this new mystery of Angel and who is Angel and what is her background, because initially she won't speak to anybody, she remains entirely silent. So something has clearly happened to her but nobody knows what it is, and Ophelia is trying to like keep her safe but also sort of investigate Wyatt and keep him safe. But then at the same time there's also another mystery that I cannot let on, but as I said, the sort of narrative takes some twists and turns that you don't necessarily expect, so there's like new threads constantly woven in there, and it's a book about missing girls and the way that people can mythologize missing girls and women, and it's really fascinating actually. I really enjoyed this book, and it just made me all the more keen to make sure I read everything by Julia Heberlin, because I think there's still one or two older books by her that I haven't checked out, and each of her books is quite unique. So there's always sort of like that Texas setting, usually quite a strong female protagonist at the centre, but at the same time the stories are all quite different. So I'm going to keep reading Julia Heberlin, and I really enjoyed this new one by her. Last but certainly not least, however, is The Majesties by Tiffany Tsao, and this book is another one I read for reading the lowest rated books on my TBR, so I'll link that vlog down below again, like I mentioned, so you can hear more of my thoughts in detail. But I was so shocked that this had a low average rating by the time I finished it, because I think this is a fantastic book, and I think the only reason that it has a low average rating is the wrong kind of readers are picking up. Like, it's the wrong book for them because of the way, say, the expectations have been built up around it. This book is sort of like a quiet, slow-paced but compelling literary mystery, and I thought it was stunning. I really enjoyed it. It is set in Singapore, and we are hearing the story from the point of view of Gwendolyn, who's one of two sisters, and she's currently in a coma, the only survivor of her sister's sort of mass murder. Her sister poisons their entire family at a big family event of around 300 people, and literally everyone dies except Gwendolyn, who is now in a coma. And she has overheard from people talking around her about what happened and how Estelle tried to kill her, and then Estelle killed herself as well. She also took the poison, and basically with nothing else to do is forced to lie there and contemplate what led up to this moment. And we sort of get a few different timelines. We get little glimpses into Gwendolyn's circumstances in her coma, but we also hear about her life growing up with Estelle. Like, her life is so intertwined with Estelle's, and really the book largely feels like it's Estelle's story, even though Gwendolyn is recounting it to us, and their time at college together, and Estelle's marriage, which doesn't go to plan. And then also the sort of weeks leading up to the murder and the suicide, and what was going on there when they were learning about some family secrets, both of them, Gwendolyn and Estelle, that they didn't know about, and piecing that all together, and how that all ties in to Estelle's perception of herself and their family and family secrets and the world around them, and what might have led her to have committed this crime. But it has quite like a dark atmosphere, but at the same time feels quite like ordinary and mundane in other respects, because it is just like a life, and we're reading about their lives. And although there's lots of secrets and maybe sort of like unhappiness, there's nothing necessarily to indicate what was to come initially. And I really enjoyed sort of just learning about Estelle and Gwendolyn, and sometimes I forgot that I was reading about someone that was in a coma and what had happened, because I was so fascinated by their lives, and then would remember why I was learning all this information and what it was going to build up to, and that would like sort of send a little shiver down your spine. Gwendolyn also has a business, which I won't tell you what it is because you learn what it is as you go along, but there's something kind of dark about that in the sort of mundane way as well, like perfectly legitimate business, but just sort of like when you hear her describing it, it just feels kind of dark. And I would really highly recommend it if you enjoy sort of atmospheric literary quietly slow paced but really compelling, like in that way that it doesn't feel like it's super action packed or rushed, but you can't put it down at the same time, because there's always something to learn and all the details feel like they're building up a very vivid picture. Yeah, I would really recommend it to that kind of reader. Those, however, are all the books that I read and finished in August. There was some DNFs if you saw my reading the lowest rated books on my TBR vlog, and obviously I really enjoyed most of these, so I would love to hear from you if you've read any of them or are just interested in reading any of them or anything else by these authors. And thank you once again to Skillshare for their continued support of this channel and sponsoring this video. Don't forget to check them out via the link in the description box down below, and until next time, happy reading. I will see you again soon. Bye everyone.